How we doing today, neighbors? Ian with eTrailer here. Today we're going to be looking at the Kodiak electric over hydraulic disc brake conversion kit on our 2020 Grand Design Reflection. Let's get into a couple features and then that install. Now, a majority of your campers and fifth wheels are going to come with a drum style brake. It's not that I don't like the drum style brakes. They're great for just short hauls and going from campsite to campsite on flat ground. But if I'm going to get into the mountains or hills, I'm definitely going to want something not only with a little bit more durability, but longevity as a whole. Those drum brakes are kind of known for overheating when worked very, very hard. These are going to not only be cooling better because it's an open rotor where you've got lots of airflow coming to that and the caliper and pads, but the longevity of that Dacromet coating is going to help keep everything nice as far as that rotor, keep any scuffing or rust away from that entire braking system. And getting into the real reason you would want to switch over from drum to this disc brake conversion kit is going to be that stopping power. You're going to see an absolute night and day difference, and throughout our testing here at eTrailer, we've found that it's cutting that stopping distance almost in half. A lot of neighbors have told us that once they've thrown this kit on, they've had to turn their brake controller down to almost the lowest setting because of the responsiveness and capability of these brakes. And one of the most important things to consider while you're switching over to disc brakes is going to be that hydraulic actuator. Today we paired that with a Deutsche Hydro Pro up here. It is pushing a full 1600 PSI back to those calipers, and realistically those calipers are only as strong as that actuator. So depending on how you're setting up and what you're looking for, I would definitely recommend this Deutsche Hydro Pro along with your kit, just because it's absolutely highly rated by our neighbors, and we found here that it functions really, really well with this kit. And for us to get a better look at this kit here, we're going to go ahead and get our fifth wheel inside and get these wheels off. So we've got our wheels and tires off here to really be able to display this kit and show off not only the nice Dacromet finish that we've got on this that's going to increase the longevity, but the entire system as a whole. We do want to mention with this kit, you are going to need a brake line kit and an actuator to have that hydraulic function at your calipers. So that is additional that you'll need to purchase. We've got nice hard and soft line kits to be able to pick from on the website, so give those a look while you're checking out these brakes. And getting into the brakes themselves, it is a slip-on kit that's just going to go over the spindle of your axle that's already existing. You're going to break that down to the point where everything's removed from your old drum system, slide over this new rotor and hub assembly with all the new bearings, re-grease that up, and then add on these calipers. Another great feature about these brakes is going to be the maintenance on them. Number one, with your drum brakes, you're not going to be able to see what specifically is going on. If you've got some type of noise or issue, you're not going to be able to peek in at the rotor like you will with this, just peeking through the wheel to see if there's any scoring or possible heating issues. That's going to help you be able to figure out specifically what needs to be done. Also, you're going to be able to see these pads really well and be able to judge the longevity of them. With the drums, you do have to pull the whole assembly off every time, which means you're either replacing or repacking your bearings at that point, and that ends up being another maintenance item that just costs more time, thus costing you more money. And with this, it's going to work the same way as any automotive disc brake would. You're going to be able to just replace the pads and keep going with that until the rotor's worn out, at which point you need to replace that. But again, you're increasing your longevity of your brakes on your trailer. Now, you will want to make sure that you check the weight rating on the axle, because the kits are going to correspond with that. You will want to make sure that that lines up, so that way you get the right size of bearings and also the correct application as far as how this will mount to the axle. Now, one way to check the weight rating of your axles, you're going to have identifier tags on the axle. It's either going to be directly stamped into it, or you'll have a sticker that specific weight ratings are listed on. Now, hopping into some information on the install, I would not attempt this in my driveway by any means. We're here in a shop setting, we've got industrial tools, and you're going to need that for this. The vehicle's going to have to be up enough to where we can access both of the wheel ends. we're going to be running lines all the way down the frame rail and then hooking up that actuator up front and doing some electrical work up there. So definitely not something I would say do in your driveway. And in that case, what you'll need to do is just check out that dealer locator tool we've got on the website, and that'll get you a trained professional that can get that hooked up for you. Now for all those DIYers that are going to be tackling this, I'm going to walk you through that whole process now. To get our new brake system on, we will need to remove the old drum and hub assembly. We'll get the vehicle safely up off the ground and have our wheel ends supported so we can take all this apart. We will need to take the cap off to begin, so you can use a flathead or even a pick or something along those lines to get in between the lip and the drum itself. Then you just kind of work your way around it and it should just walk away. Once you got that loose, you can just kind of pry away at the edges, slowly working that cap off. Then you can just use a rag or towel or something to get all that extra grease out of the way of the retainer and castle nut here. And then that gold retainer on the outside, you can just get a flathead in between and again work your way around to pry that out. And we'll set that off to the side. And then the nut should just be hand tight, so we'll back that all the way off. And right behind that nut should be a flat washer that we will remove as well. The retainer, the nut, and that flat washer we will need to set aside in a good safe place. We're going to be reusing those. Of course, we'll come back and clean off all of the grease so that way we can get new grease when we reassemble. Now we should be able to apply a little pressure to the back of the drum here and start to walk that away. You just want to watch out because that bearing will fall out as we're wiggling this back and forth. You just want to make sure you do keep that from hitting the spindle on the way out. We wouldn't want to cause any damage to that spindle. Then we'll need to go back through and with the towel just get all of that remaining grease off of our spindle. There is a signal wire at the back of the assembly that we'll need to cut, so just come behind that. And then these wires do go through the axle here and up into the bottom of the cabin area. So we can cut all this loose. We're going to be running our hydraulic lines that will make the newer brakes functions. We don't need these electronic controls anymore. We have a set of 5 9/16 nuts that we'll need to take loose. And we will hang on to those just in case. Now we'll grab the assembly and gently pull away, again avoiding hitting any part of the spindle. Now we will need to take some grease and just make sure we get that inner race for the bearing. We want to try to avoid to get any of that grease on the rotor while we're doing this. Then you can take some of that excess grease and come over to the spindle and just get that well lubricated after we've got it cleaned off so everything slides into place. Now we will need to take that rear bearing and we're going to pack that full of grease. I wanted to show a good example of how to do so. So you'll take a good glob in either the palm of your hand or up in your fingers. And we're looking for that to go in between the two pieces of the bearing race there and up to the rollers. So you just continue to mush that down into those rollers, round and round till all that's stuck into there. And of course you'd flip this over and repeat that on the other side. And once that bearing's nice and full, you'll see all of the rollers are covered and all of the race space is full. We can drop that with the conical side facing inwards. Just get that lined up. Now before we insert the seal, just run a little bit of grease on that edge. You can even steal a little bit from the bearing if need be. So that seal will sit a little bit easier. And then you want to have that just square right on top as much as possible before you start driving. You can use a seal driver to drive these. We're going to just use this hole saw that we've got. We've removed that center drill bit out of. It's just a quick, easy way. Of course, you'd want to tape around or protect yourself from those sharp edges on that. Use a driver here just to get that set into place. You do want to make sure it does go down as square as possible. And then just give it a couple taps and check it, kind of see if one edge is going faster than the other, and then you can adjust pressure to that side if needed. And once that's seated properly, you'll see it's completely flush up against the edge of the rotor. Before we mount up the bracket for the caliper, we will need to add blue Loctite to all of these studs, so just go through each one and get your dab on there. And we'll slide that up and over and line that up with the corresponding studs that will get our caliper in the correct place. And we'll come back with those 9/16 nuts and just get those threaded on. Then we'll come back through and torque all of those to the manufacturer specification. You will want to do that in a star pattern. Now very carefully we're going to want to go over the spindle, avoiding hitting the rubber seal on the inside there, and work that down. And then that should sit back into place, and we'll come back out to the front for our outer nut. Then that outer bearing is going to be lubricated just the same way we did the inner bearing, and that will seat into the brace here. You may have to lift up on that hub a little to get it to seat, and we'll take the flat washer and install that above that bearing, followed by the spindle nut. Then we're going to come back with a torque wrench, and as we're torquing that down, we'll want to make sure we rotate the hub at the same time. We'll go all the way to that torque spec. Then we'll come back from that final torque spec, and we're just going to get this to break loose, so we'll very slowly work our way back counterclockwise until it's got good give. And with that broken loose, we'll come back and just snug it up by hand. And last but not least, we'll take that retainer and slide that over. Then we'll come back and grease up. What we're going to be looking for is the grease to come from the back side of the bearing, pushing out in a flower type motion. Once we've got that, we'll just give the hub a good spin so that way it evenly coats all the surfaces within the assembly. Then we'll take that cap, try to get that as square as possible, and give that a good tap to get it into place. And then we'll put on the rubber protection cap at the end. As we're putting this on, you may find you leave a couple grease prints. It's inevitable, unfortunately, with this replacement. So you want to go back and get all that cleaned off of the rotor so it doesn't contaminate the pad. Now we'll take the caliper and lift that into place. We want to make sure we've got our guide bolts just seated far enough that we'll be able to clear the spring on the back side, but also be able to slide into the bolt holes on the back, so you'll have to hold the pads into place and move that caliper right there. Line those bolt holes up and we'll just get a thread started on each of them. Now we'll just get those kind of ran down a little bit to make the torquing process a little easier. Again, we're going to have clearance problems with the spring. So best option with our torque wrench is once we've got these down far enough, come in with a crow's foot like I've got here, or a line wrench, and we'll get those torqued to the specifications shown in the instructions. And that'll complete the installation here on this one hub. We've already gone and repeated that on all of them. It's the exact same setup either way. Once we've got that in place, then we can worry about routing our hydraulic lines and the actuator up front. Now, to start, I did want to talk about that 90-degree fitting right on the back of it. You will want to make sure that that is super snug and really secure before you put the actuator down. Otherwise, you'll have to pull the actuator back up in order to fix that if it is leaking. So definitely worth mentioning, before that's secured, make sure that 90 degrees is good to go and you've already got your hole done to be able to run the hard lines directly to the actuator. And getting into the wires coming directly off the actuator, I'm going to just go down the row here. I've got our black wire. We did have to extend. This particular setup is set up as a 6-volt in series, so it is a 12-volt system, but it does have to be tied from one end of one battery on the negative to the positive terminal on the other battery, so that way it reads as 12 volts. Otherwise, you will end up with just seeing the 6 volts if you're hooked to one side. So that white wire going to the negative on our other battery, again that black wire, they made the extension to go to the positive on the other battery. Our yellow wire is going into what's going to be our black on this duplex that we ran. We had this around the shop. You may have to get something along those lines or just 2 more wires to be able to run. This yellow one here, as it's marked, is from the cold side of the breakaway switch, and we'll take a look at that up at the neck here in a moment. And our blue guy here, as marked, is going to be from the brake controller. So this is going to be the signal telling us from the controller to actuate the actuator, and then this is if there's a failure where the breakaway switch is disconnected. Now head up to the neck and we'll take a look at that. And tracing back, we'll just start with these 2 duplex wires. We've got our white wire hooked to the blue coming out of the 7-way. That's going to give us our brake controller actuation. And then we've got the black wire out of that duplex hooked to the cold side of the breakaway switch. That way, if there is ever a catastrophic failure and disconnect, that actuator will function. And then the other wire is going to be our 12 volt coming to the breakaway switch. That way that's got power. And then on that cold side, that's where it's going to be talking to the system. Here at the front of the vehicle, we have the actuator that is secured to the pan of the vehicle using some self-tappers. And then we used a step bit to come down through the floor in order to run the 90-degree fitting, using those hard lines to drop down through the floor, coming around this pan that we've got up front, and then following existing lines and using the existing self-tappers for the belly pan just as our secure points. The kit will come with these nice little fasteners that have the rubber coating inside, so you'll be able to go all the way down the full line using the longest piece out of all of it for your main run up to the actuator, and then we'll be coming over to our first division block here. And with the length of that full line being just a little bit longer than we needed it to be, I've put this loop here to go to the divider block. And of course, we've got the first line, our soft line, going out to the brake caliper. And then we have a back line here that will go across to the other side, and we'll talk about that divider block on that side. And last out of there, we've got our line that will run to the axle back here behind and hit this caliper as well. One thing to note, when you get to the rear axle, you're going to have these adapters that are going to work with the soft line and hard line. There won't be any type of splitter block since we're just going to the one caliper. So we'll just put those in line of both of the rear calipers and the hard line. And following that line across the belly pan, we did have to use a couple zip ties. There are no cross members running anywhere near this, so unfortunately we didn't have anywhere to continue the pattern of using the self-tappers and the provided hardware. But I did find a cross member here that we've attached that 3-split block to. That's going to have our line coming in over from that first split, and then the hard line going back to the other caliper on that rear axle, and then our soft line to this front axle here. And following the hard line from that triple block there, we're going to come back and it's the exact same setup that we had on the other caliper on this rear axle, just that adapter block in the middle, and then our soft line going to the caliper. One thing to note, and I thought it'd be good to show it back here on this rear axle caliper and this soft line that we've got, these will have a tendency to kind of twist in a certain way, and you can use that towards your advantage once you've got everything hooked up and all of your hard lines ran. These soft lines are going to be the last thing you put on, so it's going to give you the opportunity to avoid any kinks or the possibility of this rubbing against the springs as the axle's traveling down the road. So it's just good to keep in mind, even as you're going through and tightening all your fittings up, to watch these soft lines, make sure they're not going to rub, make sure you've got a good idea of the extension between the jounce and rebound to your springs, so that way you know between that jounce and rebound you're not going to see anywhere on these soft lines. And with all those lines ran and the actuator hooked up to our power source, we're ready to bleed the brake system. Of course, go back through all those fittings just one more time to make sure they're as tight as they can be, and we can always go back and adjust as needed. We're going to be taking a bottle with a hose attached to it that's going to be dripping down into some fluid. That way we can see the bubbles as they end. We'll just mush that over this top fitting here. And then I've got a friend, Dustin's going to be up front working that actuator for us. You can do this with the tow vehicle and just hook it up that way and use the manual override on your brake controller if you need to, but we've got a nice little cheater box that's going to help us get it done here. Now we're going to take a line wrench. It's a 5/16 fitting at the very end. We'll need to be able to crack that loose. I did want to mention where we're starting as well is this back right caliper here. The intent is to start at the furthest point and work our way forward. Again, we're going to be looking for the air bubbles coming through our hose here, And once we've got no air bubbles coming out of this fitting, that end is done, and we'll move on, just continuing forward up. And crack it open. Go ahead, Dustin. Okay, I'm gonna close it. Now we did find one leaking fitting to start. So as you're going through this, not only are we looking to get rid of those air bubbles, but we'll need to make sure we close up any leaking lines we find along the way, because those will pull more air into the system and we'd have to start all the way over. So as you're going along, just make sure you're keeping an eye on all of the lines, but our first one here needs just a little tightening down. And there we see more bubbles coming out. And with everything bled and all of the system checked for leaks, I did want to mention again the order that we went in for the axles, just so that way it's clear. We are starting at the farthest away, so in our case that was the passenger rear side. We came over to the driver rear after that, and then moved up to the passenger front, and then that driver front. And again, you'll want to follow all those lines, and best thing to do is, as you do each caliper, just make sure you're going back through those lines one more time to double check all of those fittings. You will have some situations where you might have a couple leaks, and again will cause air in the system, so we want to avoid that. But with everything bled, you can check everything just by running the actuator with that hooked up vehicle, or in our case our cheater box that we're using, and make sure that the brakes do hold. So just give those wheels a good spin, make sure that the brakes are functioning as intended. You don't have any spongy feeling. It doesn't feel like there's no resistance at all, because at that point you probably need to go back and bleed the system a little further to get any air bubbles out. But with all that done, you'll be able to put back on your wheels and tires and head back on the road. And that's going to do for our look at and installation of our Kodiak disc brakes on our 2020 Grand Design Reflection.